It's great to meet all of you, people I have not met before. A few people here are old friends of mine. I guess I'll tell you a little bit about myself and my work while this is getting set up. So I actually started my career with Amnesty International 20 years ago. When I first moved to DC, I was an intern in the DC office working against the death penalty. That's where I first met Phyllis, and later David, Kathleen, and other people. So I started there as an intern, but I was also really involved in Amnesty's work on LGBT rights, which at that time was just beginning to be a concept that Amnesty was really taking seriously. So I was among a small group of volunteers who were helping really get that on the radar of Amnesty, and Amnesty being such a big player in the international human rights movement. It also meant we were helping get it on the map for the human rights movement in general. About 10 years ago, the Belarus reference will make sense, I got the opportunity to go to the International Council meeting of Amnesty International, which is the every 2-year international meeting. That was in Mexico, and at that conference, I met the chair of Amnesty International Belarus. We hit it off, we started seeing each other, and last year, once the Supreme Court said we could, we got married after 10 years. So, he's now my husband. He's still very active on Belarusian issues, and Belarus, if he was here, he would want me to say, is the last dictatorship in Europe. It's the only European country that still has a death penalty, and it's a lot of human rights problems there. He's still involved in trying to solve. So, for those of you who are not already involved with Amnesty, I would say you should get involved. If you want to, you can launch your career there, you can make a million friends there, you can come out there if you need to do that, and you can meet your husband or wife there. That all happened for me just through Amnesty. So since leaving Amnesty, so I went back and forth, I worked on the Amnesty staff a couple times over the years while I was in law school. Since finishing, I've worked in a few other positions, but for the last 9 years, I was working for the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, which is an organization that focuses on K-12 issues. The last couple of years of that, I was the public policy director. So actually, we worked a lot with Brian Sims on and Equality Pennsylvania on the PASS Act, and a little bit, I think after I left, maybe the conversion therapy. And I've met your boss, and he's a great guy. Okay. Yeah.
PowerPoint is open at the bottom of the screen.
So, I can keep going a little bit. So this past fall, I switched positions, and I'm now working at Human Rights First, which is an international human rights organization, and my focus is on international LGBT issues. So that's what I'll be talking about. Okay.
Can everybody see these screens? I know it's tilted a little bit this way.
Which one?
Can you see it? On your, can that be tilted a little?
Yeah,
She can't see it.
Just let me know when you will start.
Okay. Thank you.
So, okay, I'll get started. That's fine. As soon as it comes up, we can take it from there. So for a quick overview about what is the situation for LGBT people around the world, you'll hear different numbers depending on who's counting, but right now homosexuality is illegal in somewhere around 80 countries. I think this says 76, but there are different numbers sort of depending on how you interpret the various laws. That punishment can include life imprisonment, and I'll talk about some of the most recent cases, countries that we've all been paying attention to in the last couple of months. In 7 countries, homosexuality is still technically punishable by death. 5 countries where it's throughout the country, it's Iran, Saudi Arabia, Mauritania, Yemen, and Somalia. And in sections of Nigeria and Sudan, still technically punishable by death. So once this comes up, you'll see, oh, maybe it's just about now. There's a map here. There you go. Anyway, I'm sure it'll come up in a second, but this is, and we'll take a look at this together, but this is the map that's produced by the International Lesbian and Gay Association of LGBT rights around the world. And actually, since this is a pretty informal setting, if people have questions, I think it's okay with me if you all want to jump in. I think there's some time at the end reserved just for that. So some of the things that we've been working on recently, so I just started in October and immediately started working on Russia. We've been very, very engaged in Russia. If you know anything about Russia, you know there are already a lot of pretty bad human rights issues in Russia. Civil society has been sort of attacked and shrunk. There's a lot of corruption. Putin is basically running it more like a dictator than a democracy. But things are getting a lot worse in the past year for the LGBT community. There's been laws designed to attack NGOs. One is called the Foreign Agents Law, which makes it so that NGOs cannot take any foreign funding. Oh, here we go. It's working.
Hey, Shawn?
Oh, slowly. Yeah.
For NGOs, for people who don't.
Oh, sure. Like non-governmental organizations. So organizations like Amnesty can barely exist in Russia, and if they do, they're sort of under a lot of scrutiny. If you take money from a foreign source, you could be penalized under what's called the Foreign Agents Law. And most recently, last year, President Putin signed something called the Anti-Propaganda Law. So this law is supposed to be about providing information and propaganda about homosexuality to minors. But in reality, it doesn't have to be to minors. People publishing articles in major newspapers that are not directed at minors are being charged under this law. And there are a lot of people starting to get charged under this law. Basically, it sort of equates anything that's about non-traditional sexual relationships. So it's actually a little bit more than just LGBT people. If you're a supporter of LGBT people or a supporter of marriage equality, not that there are a lot of supporters of marriage equality in Russia, it is fairly homophobic, then you could also potentially be charged under this law. This is the map that I was mentioning, and I guess it's kind of hard to see, but maybe there'll be a way I can forward it around to people.
Could you identify the color code?
Oh, yes. I will need to look over here to do that. The dark red is death penalty. The sort of brighter red is imprisonment from 14 years to life. Going down in shade, imprisonment up to 14 years. This orange is imprisonment, no precise indication of length of punishment. This yellow is unclear legislation. And this is persecution by organized non-state agents. And actually the ILGA website has a lot of different maps. It's a great website to check out. They have marriage equality maps, and they take on all kinds of different issues.
So bright green is the good one?
Bright green in this case is the good one, yeah. Where there's no, this is all about punishment for LGBT status.
Okay, well, I know like Vladimir Putin also has a prime minister that's supposed to be like keeping him from basically becoming a dictator. Does he?
So I'm doing a very good job.
Does he like please speak a little louder? Or is he just kind of like not doing anything?
Yeah, I mean, so the question was about, I think his name is Medvedev, who became the prime minister, and Putin sort of cycled out and then back in. I think there was some hope that he was going to be better on all issues, but I don't think, I mean, I'm not an expert on Russia, but my sense is he was never really empowered to do much. He was still he was there just covering the office while Putin had to step down because of term limits, and then he could come back in power. So one of the things that happened last year that was a real, oh, did you have a question? Oh, sorry. One of the things that happened last year that was a real concern is there was a new law that was introduced that would be a reform to the family code in Russia. It would basically allow the Russian authorities to take children out of families that are headed by same-sex couples, or again, even more than that, even just couples who are supportive of LGBT issues, but really targeted at same-sex couples. That law got pulled in maybe October. but the plan is that it'll be reintroduced in the spring after the Olympics, and everyone seems to believe that it will be. So that would be a real concern, because that would be sort of a different kind of law than we've seen before. That would be a big concern. So this is about the anti-propaganda law that I mentioned. This is a map that shows where those, this is a map that's showing the surrounding area. So as you know, Russia's a huge player in that part of the world, obviously, and pretty impervious to what the rest of the world thinks about it. The fact that it just invaded another sovereign country is very unusual in this day and age, and the fact is they are going to get away with it, probably today. I think the referendum is today, and there's nothing we can do about it, basically. There's nothing anyone will really do about it. Sanctions and some other things, but in reality, already more or less has happened.
If Crimea chooses to join Russia, are they also going to have these laws that Putin put in place imposed on them?
Yeah. They've started passing these on the regional level, and then they passed the federal law, so basically it covers all of Russia now. And what we're really concerned about, so one thing I should mention about human rights first is a lot of the way we do our work is about pressuring the US government to do more. So different than Amnesty. So we wouldn't be writing directly to President Putin, most likely. We might, but most of the time we'd be writing to President Obama, the State Department, people on the Hill, asking them to take certain actions in response to Putin. So part of my job in terms of figuring out where we're going to get involved is figuring out where the US can actually play a role. And Russia is not a great example of that. Again, like I was saying about with Ukraine right now, Russia really doesn't care what the US thinks about it, and we have very little leverage in Russia. One of the things we are concerned about now, though, is whether this anti-propaganda law type of law will spread across the region. Russia, as everybody knows, I'm sure, is a huge, powerful player in the region. Obviously, all the countries that are highlighted in yellow here were all part of the Soviet Union. So there's still obviously a lot of cultural connections and a lot of Russians in these other places. That was sort of the reason they said they had to go into Ukraine, is because of ethnic Russians living there. So right now we're tracking laws in all these areas surrounding Russia. I don't know if you can see them all, but it's Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Georgia to the very south, and Kyrgyzstan, we just found out about the other day, sort of down in the corner, is also introducing such a law. They're likely to pass in some of these countries. The Russian Orthodox Church is sort of hand in hand now with the Putin government, and they are very powerful in all of these countries, sometimes under other names like the Ukrainian Orthodox Church or the Georgian Church, but it's more or less the same thing. So you'll see one little bright spot, which is the tiny little country of Moldova that's in pink. That is a great example for everybody, although I wish it was a bigger country than Moldova, because I don't think Moldova people particularly follow Moldova and what they've done. But Moldova did have an anti-propaganda law, and they overturned it just within the past year. Why did they overturn it? They overturned it for money. They want to be part of the European Union. They want more benefits of being engaged with Europe. So for whatever reason, they took that step of overturning it to be more in line with the views of Europe. We're hopeful that Georgia could do the same, and partly this is one of those weird moments when you look to the fact that Georgians don't like Russia as a leverage point for maybe we can get Georgia not to pass this kind of law because they don't want to be like Russia. And most of the big attraction is to be more connected to the West, to Europe. And that's what's playing out now in Ukraine. Just the other day, just 2 days ago, we got word that Lithuania was about to pass an anti-propaganda law. The opponents of LGBT equality introduced it the day the legislature opened, and 2 days later there was going to be a vote on it, and I think they were hoping for the element of surprise to make it happen. That vote was stopped and sort of put on hold. We put out some statements and did some work around it. I don't think we were the ones that made it happen, but for whatever reason, it's on hold. And that's probably good. That probably means that there's more time. The longer it sits out there, I think there's at least an opportunity to bring more pressure so it doesn't pass.
Can I ask a question?
Oh, sure.
Because I'm still up here and I don't have to answer it right now. But at some point, can you kind of give a snapshot of what Western Europe looks like, and either individually, Germany, France, England, and as a whole, what the European Union is saying, and what the requirements to be, what can and can't a country do as far as LGBT work in order to be part of the European Union?
You know, I actually probably can't really answer that completely. I'm not a total expert on that. I do know that I would imagine that most of the countries in Western Europe have marriage equality or strong civil unions. Sort of Western and Northern Europe in general is all very good around LGBT issues. We see very little stuff coming out of there that we're concerned about. Sort of when you get a little farther down to Central Europe, there's still, like in Serbia and Montenegro and some countries like that, there's still problems. But the European Union has been a really strong mechanism for getting states to act better in terms of LGBT issues. Like a place like Moldova, they're not so supportive of LGBT rights that they just wanted to get rid of that law. They did it for a reason. But in my opinion, people can catch up. If the law passes before people are necessarily ready for it, I think people will catch up. And to be honest with you, even though I sound kind of negative about it, I don't really think that the Russian people are just inherently homophobic. I think Putin has used this as an opportunity to sort of stoke up that fear, and so I think it's a little bit of like a political game more than a real comment on the Russian people. All right, this is. Seems like it's not loading any longer. Does anyone want to take a look maybe?
Yeah.
It's just saying you can't display it.
Oh, there we go. Okay. But it's sort of in a weird angle. So, okay, another place where we've been active lately is in Africa. You may have heard about Nigeria and Uganda. They've been in the news a lot lately. Both countries have introduced new laws designed to penalize the LGBT population. You could see that there are real concerns around Africa. South Africa is a real leader on this issue, was, I believe, the very first country to enshrine non-discrimination for LGBT people in their constitution. So it's not as if all is lost in an entire continent. And there are people speaking out in various countries in support of LGBT rights, but it's not an environment that's very easy to do. Again, it's basically like Putin. The leaders there are using it as a way to stay in power. So if they feel like their base is crumbling or they're worried, the easiest way to shore up their power is to go after a very unpopular minority group, which are LGBT people. So again, you probably can't read this, but it's just a version of that other map that is a little more focused on these countries. So Uganda, this law was passed just in the past couple of weeks. It imposes harsh criminal penalties for same-sex relationships. You can get life in prison for aggravated homosexuality, which is always sounds funny to me. Which is, well, it could be if there's someone with HIV in the relationship, sex with minors, which of course is legitimately something that should be penalized and is penalized, sex with people who are disabled, and also repeated sexual offenses among consenting adults. Conducting a same-sex marriage in Nigeria or in Uganda is punishable by 7 years in prison, and people who are supportive of LGBT rights can also face penalties. The interesting thing is that sometimes these are phrased around marriage. This is like a way to, we're not in support of marriage in Uganda, same-sex marriage, therefore we're going to put this law into place. When in reality, nobody's expecting that Uganda is going to pass same-sex marriage anytime soon, like most countries. But they use it because people hear about it, they know about it, and they're concerned about it happening in their country. So they use it as a way to move this through. One thing that we've been really nervous about in the past couple weeks is there is a paper there called The Red Pepper that is basically a tabloid, and they've been naming homosexuals in the paper, printing pictures of 200 people that they claim are homosexual. And in the past, when this happened, there was a Ugandan activist who was killed. They published their names, addresses, phone numbers, and it's a real concern, obviously, that people will be killed. So it seems like it's stopped here, but maybe we'll go into that. Nigeria, this actually took people by surprise. This law had been considered last year, seemed like, or 2 years ago, it seemed like we had dodged the bullet, but then it was very quickly pushed through. There was not a quorum when it went through. There were lots of sort of irregularities about how it went through, but in any case, it went through. It provides for up to 14 years in jail for same-sex marriage, 10 years in jail for membership in a gay rights organization. And actually, in Nigeria, it's been a little bit worse in terms of the immediate reaction. There have been, there were lists of people that the police had already had ready to go, and they have been rounding people up and arresting them. There have been men charged with being gay who have been whipped in public, and there have been mobs that have formed around courthouses where people are being tried for homosexuality inside. So Nigeria is a big concern. The last country I'll mention specifically is India. This one hasn't gotten as much attention. I'm not quite sure why. I guess there hasn't been quite as dramatic of a story, but in India for many, many years, homosexuality was illegal. Same-sex relationships were criminalized. But I don't know, maybe 3 years ago, they overturned this law. It's called Section 377 of the Penal Code, and it all of a sudden, you know, the criminalization law was gone. Just this past few months, there was a new court case when they basically reinstated Section 377. So now, once again, it is illegal to be gay in India. There haven't been as many reports of violence, but there have been some. So one of the things we really worry about with these laws, so in Uganda you could argue nobody's yet been tried under the law. In India, I don't think anybody has yet been tried under the law. But the concern is that it sets the stage for people outside of the government to take matters into their own hands and sort of pursue vigilante violence. And it sets the tone for this to be permissible. And other forms of discrimination, but violence being the biggest concern. I don't know if any of you have seen in Russia, there's a series of videos that people are putting online where they're basically luring gay men to an apartment or a house, and then on the premise of a date, that they're going on a date, and then like brutally torturing them, forcing them to do awful things. There have been some suicides, and then putting it online. So to me, it's really chilling when you can see who did it. It's right there on the screen, and they don't make an attempt to even hide who they are. Sometimes it's a whole group of people, mostly men, sometimes women, who are humiliating and torturing these young guys, mostly. And all their faces are right on the screen, and you know that the police in their town know who they are. But they won't do anything. The police will not do anything. So basically, what does that say? It says it's open season. You can do whatever you want, and nobody's going to stop you. And it's scary. I have asked people in Russia, doesn't this at least concern average Russians that perpetrators of violent crime can be known to the police and the police won't take any action? Even if you're not gay or you're not sympathetic to gay people, doesn't it make you nervous that the police won't act if something happens to you? And the answer, unfortunately, is most people believe that there's nothing wrong with what these guys are doing, that there's no reason the police should intervene because there's something wrong with what they're doing. I will say these guys that do these videos, they do it under the guise of anti-pedophilia. So they claim to be going after pedophiles, but in reality, they're, in most of the cases I've seen, and I certainly can't really watch them very much, it's impossible, they're minors themselves that they're going after. Minors that are think they're going out on a date with another minor. All right, this seems like it's totally stuck, so I'll just leave it alone for now. So this last year, or no, a couple weeks ago, I had the opportunity to go to Sochi during the Olympics. Oh, here we go. Obviously, everybody was very concerned about, oh, so that's really going. Okay, I'm gonna go back a little bit and just show you what we missed. All right, so this is, and I could share this somehow later, I think, through Phyllis and Kathleen. So it's about Uganda, Nigeria, tells you a little bit about law, but I basically read this. This is about India, Section 377. And now, not to be too depressing, let's talk about some recent successes. And there are, of course, successes all the time. In Lebanon, there is an anti-LGBT law that basically was thrown out just a couple weeks ago with this court case that determined, it was a really interesting ruling. They basically said the law in Lebanon was about like unnatural sexual relations. And the court kind of said, if it's a relationship that a human can enter into, it can't be unnatural. So, okay, great. So they got rid of that law. I don't know why they couldn't have thought about that a long time ago, but and that's good because the Middle East is also is fairly repressive in terms of LGBT issues. Moldova, I mentioned, was a success in that they overturned their anti-propaganda law, and we've seen marriage equality continuing to pass, UK, France, New Zealand, and Uruguay, all in the past couple, all in 2013. So I mentioned we had an opportunity to go to Russia during the Olympics. There was obviously a lot of attention on Russia. What's going to happen? I think most people believe that it would be fairly quiet throughout the Olympics, that Putin was going to basically clamp down everything, so nothing would happen that could embarrass the country. But in reality, there were dozens and dozens of arrests throughout the Olympics. We met with activists in St. Petersburg, in Moscow, and Sochi. In St. Petersburg, we met with 4 activists who were pretty much 4 of the leaders of the whole movement in Russia. And the very next day, the day of the opening ceremonies, one of them was arrested in St. Petersburg. When we went to Sochi, we met with a few different activists there, both on LGBT issues. This one guy we met was great. The mayor of Sochi had said publicly there are no gay people in Sochi. And this kid who's like 21 years old wrote to the mayor and said, I want to introduce myself, I'm a gay person, I live in Sochi, and happy to meet with you anytime. So he had no idea the story became international news. So we sort of tracked him down and met with him, and that was pretty funny. And then and we also met with a guy who works on migrant workers, which is a whole other area, not my area of expertise, but really awful. So they bring thousands and thousands of migrant workers in, like dozens, tens of thousands, from all over Central Asia and parts of Russia. And some of you who work on this issues probably are aware of this. I was a little bit aware of it, but they take their papers from them immediately, so they have nowhere to go. They're put in awful conditions with no water, no toilets, no kitchens. People have to pay neighbors to use their bathroom, to use their kitchen, and they're making almost nothing to begin with. Awful working conditions, of course, no minimum wage, no hour restrictions, no safety for on the job, and then some of them are just deported. They're given that either their papers are withheld, so they're really screwed, or they're given their papers back and deported without being paid. So this organization helps in these cases and has actually been successful in getting money for people. And that guy was arrested after we met with him too. I don't think we had anything to do with it, but people kept getting arrested after we met with them. What are the effects of homophobia we're worried about? These are probably pretty obvious, although some of them might not be quite as much. Violence sort of within the community, rejection by the family, employment discrimination and education discrimination, which we've talked about already today. Health impacts are huge. Right now we're already hearing about AIDS clinics in Uganda that are closing out of fear. People who are openly LGBT and need to get health services are going off their antiretrovirals, which, are at this point, many of them are funded from the US government. They're very cheap. They're keeping people alive, and people are going off of them because they're afraid, because they think they need to be out as gay to get this help. Imprisonment, obviously, under these new laws, and poverty, which is sort of comes from all the other forms of discrimination. This is my friend Scott Lively, some of you may know, anti-gay activist who has sort of done everything he can do to hurt people here in the United States and is now traveling around the world and instigating these laws. He's been in Uganda, he's been in Russia, he's been everywhere, and he's just a really bad guy. So what are some of the challenges in doing the work on LGBT issues? And this is something that we could talk about for a long time, but I will just mention a couple things. One is, and this is maybe the biggest sort of philosophical challenge that I think people face, is in many places throughout the world, going in to talk about LGBT rights does not resonate with people. We think of it here sort of as within the trajectory of different civil rights movements where, small groups who are minorities in the population sort of seek out their rights and push for their rights to be recognized. But in many places, that concept doesn't really resonate in the same way. There isn't sort of an LGBT identity in a lot of places. Some places are just more sort of fluid. Some places it is not uncommon for people to perhaps engage in same-sex activity and then go on to get married. The idea of identifying yourself as a member of the LGBT community and seeking rights based on your membership in that community is not something that makes sense everywhere. So you can't just take US-based campaigns and go to other places and try to make them work. And that sort of goes into the next thing, which is Western strategies. So some of the things that we think, oh, this really worked here, why don't we go here and do this? It's not going to work at all. Religious fundamentalism is obviously a big problem. Some of that is exported from the US, but not all of it. Russia and that whole surrounding area, that's not really about Christianity, it's more about the Orthodox Church. But there are a lot of US-based preachers going overseas and causing a lot of trouble. And then they act shocked when this law goes into effect that they didn't mean for that to happen at all. But they were there stepping up the flames. And family responsibilities. In a lot of countries, say India for example, you're absolutely required to, if you're a male, especially the oldest male, you really have to get married, and your wife will take care of your mother, you'll take care of your parents. And so the idea of sort of having a life as a gay person and not having those things attached to it is a big hurdle and a hard one to overcome. Within the US, what do we see as challenges? For a long time, there's been so much we've needed to do in the United States around LGBT equality that a lot of people aren't thinking yet about what's happening overseas. I think there's more and more interest in this, particularly as we achieve some of the gains like don't ask, don't tell, hate crimes, and employment non-discrimination. Not a reality yet, but you can sort of see the pathway for how that's going to happen. We probably just need the Congress to change. The other thing is a lack of constituents. So if you're a House member anywhere in Connecticut, you don't have LGBT Nigerians in your district who are asking you to take certain actions, right? You may be in a district that has a lot of a particular group, say Nigerians or Jamaicans, but presumably they're not going to be all LGBT Nigerians or Jamaicans, so you're very small numbers of constituents that are actually impacted. And of course, if they're actually your constituent, they're living in the US, so even if they're of that nationality, they're not being impacted by these laws. So, Amnesty would be an exception where people are writing to their members around these issues, but even within Amnesty, it's a small segment of the work that we're doing. So we hear on the Hill all the time, people say, nobody's talking to me about this from my district. And obviously that's all, especially house members, care about, is just getting reelected. And if there's no pressure in their district to do this, then they're not going to do it. Because there's sort of pressure on the other side in terms of, sometimes in terms of religious communities. And then the real big problem is limited response mechanisms. What can we do if a country, and this is a challenge we face at Human Rights First because of our push to get the US government to do the right thing. In Russia, I've already mentioned, a great example, there's almost nothing we can do. There's nothing we can do that will really impact Russia in a big way. We could do visa bans, so banning top officials from coming to the United States, but those already exist for Russia. And keep in mind that Russia will retaliate, so if we do visa bans, so will they, and they have. This happened, it's played out exactly like that. So visa bans, okay, that's great, but most people are not trying to get to are never going to come to the United States. Top level officials it may impact, but otherwise people aren't going to be impacted greatly. Asset freezing is something that we do have done in certain cases, but that's complicated. That's actually a stronger response, but it's not in our best interest either because we're relying on these assets being in the United States, and we want people to feel comfortable investing in the United States and not always being worried that their assets will get frozen. So we only do that in really dire situations. And in both of these examples, if you're thinking about Russia, unless the European Union does the same thing, it doesn't really have much of an impact. If we all agree to do visa bans and asset freezing, that might have an impact, but it's going to be harder for them to do that because they're more tied in with their economies. A big question that's coming up all the time right now is about foreign aid. Why don't we just cut off all this aid to Nigeria and Uganda, and probably don't provide as much to Russia, but there would be some training and things like that that we do. And that sounds right, maybe when you first think about it, but in reality, it's not an answer as satisfying as it might sound at moments, particularly when this law gets initially passed and everybody starts talking about cutting aid. The problem is, there's two problems. One is you're running the risk of creating a backlash against the LGBT community in that country who will be held responsible for the loss of this aid. And if this community is already under fire, imagine if there's huge health impacts happening to other parts of the population that people think were caused by the LGBT community. And the government doesn't limit itself to pointing to the LGBT community as a problem for anything. So that's a huge concern. Bigger concern is that LGBT people are some of the most assisted by the aid, because a lot of it is HIV funding through a program called PEPFAR. So if you were to cut off the aid, you would be having a big impact on LGBT populations that rely on that aid. So what do we do? Actually, sometimes it can even be worse. So in Uganda, we just found out, or I just found out, some people have done this, that some of the aid that was funneling to one religious group in Uganda, this group was actually putting ads in the paper calling for the anti-homosexuality law to be passed. So you could argue that we are directly funding a group that is pushing for this law, which is not in our interest. And it feels really tempting to just want to cut that off, right? Like, stop giving those people money. But they are working all throughout Uganda in areas that nobody else is working in, nobody else is equipped to work in. So at the same time, they are pushing for criminalization, but they're also the only people reaching a lot of the Ugandan population. So what can you do about that? One thing that is being talked about right now on the Hill, there are proposals being sort of drafted and floated. One is to divert the money away from the government into the NGO sector. That can be good. That sends a signal to the government. But at the same time, the NGO communities in these places are often running, with very little resources. This amount of money is overwhelming for these small organizations, and they're not necessarily equipped to take on the role of government. And in fact, it's taking the responsibility off the government for doing what it should do in regards to its people and saying the NGOs are now going to do this. So the NGOs aren't equipped to do it, and really it shouldn't be their job to basically serve as the government. So it becomes very complicated, and I don't think anybody has a really good answer to it. I mean, I think what people are thinking about now is we are not saviors that are coming in to tell people, here's how it should be done. And every country, no matter how bad it may seem, in Uganda, Nigeria, Russia, India, there are active groups of LGBT people and supporters of LGBT people who are already organized. They're under a lot of pressure, but they're organized. They know what they want to accomplish. They have goals and they have plans, strategies to get there. So we like to come in and say, you know, how can we help support your efforts? There may be some things we can come up with that hadn't occurred or that they haven't tried. There might be some things like that we can do. But in reality, it's mostly about partnering with existing movements on the ground. You know, the big problem that we run into all the time is that LGBT, as I was talking about before with the identity stuff, LGBT is considered a Western concept. So every place you go or you read about, you will hear them say, you know, this being gay is not Nigerian, this is not African, this is not Ukrainian, this is not Russian. There's a belief that this is all imported from the West. So it makes it even harder, and it makes it even more important that we're supporting people who are there standing up and saying, you know, I'm a gay Ugandan or a gay Ukrainian. One thing we try to do is focus on broader shared beliefs. So if people are not sympathetic to LGBT people in a place like Russia, can you find some common ground with them around corruption? Corruption is a big problem in Russia, something everybody's angry about. And so can you use anti-corruption as sort of your framework for building coalitions? All these different groups, maybe they fear corruption for different reasons. Privacy is another one. You may, for any number of reasons, be concerned about encroachments on your privacy. So you may not be very sympathetic to LGBT people, but you don't think the government should be interfering in the private life of a family or a couple. So maybe there's a way to sort of build coalitions around those concepts. And impunity, like I mentioned before, the idea that the government, especially for small minority groups, minority within the demographics, not necessarily ethnic minorities, but religious minorities, people with disabilities, when they see the government not acting to stop violence or discrimination, maybe there's something we can all come together on and agree that impunity is not good for the nation. And I think that's everything I have. I'm glad to answer questions people have, or if people have comments or want to say anything.
I'll start with the next one.
Really?
Couple of questions?
Sure.
And I know that, I'm sure you're not an expert in every region in the world, but two kind of sort of questions. South Africa being progressive, do the South African people, you know, either the coalitions or even the government have any influence at all, or do they engage on any level with other African countries? Hold that thought.
Mm-hmm.
And you haven't touched at all on Latin American countries. Some of them are very religious, more so than others. And if you have any information, just a quick update on the Asian countries.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, just Africa, Asia, and Latin America, okay. So very quickly, no, South Africa, yes, South Africa not only was sort of a pioneer in its own right, but did at least start out exerting a lot of influence over other parts of Africa. I think they felt they got a little pushback from that and have been have receded a little bit. They had they had proposed a resolution at the United Nations, the first resolution specifically on LGBT stuff. And I think they were feeling like they were facing a little backlash, and maybe that they weren't going to be as effective if they were always the only country out there. So they're still very actively engaged. I've heard that there are some efforts underway where they're planning to sort of go back into a leadership role on this issue. But in some cases, unfortunately, in some cases, like in Nigeria, for example, they may already lump in South Africa with the West, even though it's South Africa. So yeah, they still have a really important role to play. But our hope is that we'll start seeing more and more voices from other places. I mean, just in the past couple months, there have been, the former president of Mozambique came out with a very sweeping statement about respecting LGBT people. There was a justice minister in Ethiopia who made some really great comments. The First Lady of Zambia. There's been a whole number of people. So I think it's going to start happening. There's going to be a little more space, and hopefully people will follow suit. Latin America is actually, in general, pretty good on LGBT rights. There are some places where it is tough, where there is violence. There's a lot of violence directed at the trans community, which is obviously a concern. In Brazil, there are a lot of killings of LGBT people, but particularly trans people, particularly sex workers. That's something that will probably get more attention with the Olympics going to Brazil next. It's not, I mean, like for my Amnesty training, I don't compare two countries necessarily, but Brazil is not Russia, but there are still some issues there. I think because a lot of the countries are sort of left-leaning in their politics, they've been better. And there's some pockets that are not good. Honduras, I'm not so sure about the government position, but there's a lot of violence, and violence including to the LGBT community. And there are some countries in that area that are sort of stand out as not good. The Caribbean is pretty bad, which is actually surprising to a lot of people. And one of the places we're probably going to do some effort, some focused work is in Jamaica, which many people describe as the worst country for LGBT rights in the whole Western Hemisphere. People are thrown out of their towns when they're found out that they're gay. People have been beaten on the street, and there have been a crowd of people who are egging that on. Again, this is all holdovers from colonization. You know, these are all British colonies. Not all British colonies. The ones I'm thinking of right now are British colonies. So, you know, they will argue these laws were forced upon us. We may not have had a tradition of excluding gay people. This law was put into place, and this dynamic grew about straight people and gay people, and now, you know, good Great Britain got rid of its laws, but now there's these legacies all over the place. So Jamaica is one of the countries I think that's the biggest concern, and that people are fully aware of. Asia, I'm not so up to speed on. I've actually been reading a little bit about some countries. You know, one of the interesting things about US foreign policy is there's a country like China, where it's actually not a very bad country. There's some pressure on the NGO community. It's not a particularly open, vibrant LGBT culture, but it's not as repressive as some people might guess. But in terms of pushing on China, there are so many other issues between the United States and China that trying to talk about LGBT rights in China will get you nowhere. And I think that's a real problem. I mean, Saudi Arabia would be a perfect example. That's one of the countries where you can still be executed for being gay. But do you think we're ever going to say anything about Saudi Arabia? Never. But Japan, Korea are very good. Nepal and some other small countries have been good. I've learned recently, like that Vietnam, there's some problems that I wasn't really aware of. So a little bit of a mixed bag, but overall I think is fairly good. And partly I think they don't have the tradition, the sort of religious traditions as like Christianity and Muslim, and in some cases, well, I'd say Christianity and Muslim are probably the two, and please, I'm not picking on any particular religion, but when you look at places where there are anti-LGBT forces that come out of a religious community, Christians, Muslims tend to be two of the groups that can be strongestly opposed to LGBT rights, and like the Russian Orthodox too. But in Asia, a lot of countries are, with different religions, so it's not as much of a culture there. That's everything.
You mentioned Saudi Arabia. I believe next week the president is going there. This would be a good time to reach out to the White House. I know.
Sorry, I'm so cynical already. We wrote a letter our organization wrote a letter to the president about Saudi Arabia, and we didn't mention LGBT issues. So that's how much even human rights groups kind of choose their battles. I mean, the truth is there aren't a lot of reports of people being executed in Saudi Arabia. They can be, so the law exists. I don't think we know that it's employed a lot. I think it's a pretty underground community in the first place, but it's not on the radar as something that anyone's trying to deal with, frankly. I mean, I'm sure there's a Saudi community that's trying to push back, but I think and it's awful to think about things in terms of like bigger issues, but I mean, truthfully, if we're pushing on things like freedom for civil society, there are things that we're going to be pushing for that will have positive impacts on the LGBT community, but even we're not talking about LGBT issues in Saudi Arabia. We are writing a letter to the president because he's going to meet with the Pope, and then the Pope is going to Uganda, and obviously does a lot of. And actually, I, as a sort of someone who was raised Catholic, not particularly Catholic at the moment, I think there's a lot of good that can come from the Pope. I mean, David Cardinal is talking about homosexuality shouldn't be a crime, shouldn't be criminalized. And I mean, I'd love to see the church go farther than that, but I think that's actually pretty good if they're going to make that case.
I know there's a move to try and get the Secret Service to get the president to have a female driver in his car.
Oh, in Saudi Arabia?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think that the Pope's more liberal stance on gay marriage will have any effect on people trying to use their religion as a justification for being against gay marriage?
I do. So, I think he's been pretty firm that he's not going for gay marriage, but he did talk about, recently he said a couple things that have people speculating he could be for civil unions, which is still a huge step forward. So in some ways, it could actually set the marriage equality movement back a little bit, because now there's sort of a bigger worldwide agreement on civil unions, so maybe some places will sort of get stuck there, but still would be probably a step forward. So I think he's going to have a huge impact. I mean, I think everybody was shocked that first time when he answered this question and said, "Who am I to judge?" It's like, well, you're the Pope. I've been judging people for a long time, like your predecessors have. But we're already hearing like Catholic voices in other countries reflecting back what the Pope is saying. So I think it could be huge.
What percentage of the religion pressure is segregating the LGBT communities?
So in terms of how, within the religious community, how many of them are anti?
No, because religion is segregating so many, but what is the percentage in the religion communities?
Of people who are LGBT?
No.
Sorry.
It's like, for example, religion is the main pressure against LGBT communities. How many?
I think I think I understand what you're saying. Like, is that the biggest force? Religious? Yeah. That's a good question. I'm not sure if I know the answer to that. I mean, Because like I was mentioning, like with India, with family structure, and that's a huge country, right? In China, where two of the biggest countries, maybe the two biggest countries, population-wise, are, I don't think in either of those places it's particularly religious focused. It's more about sort of community expectations, family, traditional roles and responsibilities. As far as I know, like in Hinduism, there aren't strict prohibitions on homosexuality, so it's more cultural and like, how can you be gay? You have to take care of your parents, right? You have to get married, you have to take care of your parents. So it's hard to say, it's hard to even guess what percentage, because I think it would be so different from country to country. I will say, you know, there are a lot of, obviously, people who follow this know a lot of religious communities are progressing very rapidly on these issues. So you've always had like, you know, Unitarians and folks like that who have been, and Quakers and stuff who have been there. But mainstream churches are now changing their tune too over time, which is great. I think the Catholics were, you know, one of the holdouts, and the fact that that's happening is great.
Yeah. I run an Advocacy news site, and what I'm hearing from Kenya and Uganda is, first of all, I don't think anyone really cares if anyone's gay or not. I don't think the laws are anything. I think it's a mechanism to further oppress people and to further steal. I know I heard from Kenya, very prominent scientists who took a colleague for a walk somewhere in Nairobi, and these cops stopped him and they said, we're going to arrest you for being gay unless you give us money. I'm also hearing this in Uganda. Now what's really frightening me is Nigeria, which of course is the most populous country in Africa. And it has the biggest diaspora in the United States. They are more opposed to gay than anyone. And I'm talking to them. I have a very good friend who's a minister in Christ Apostolic Church in Baltimore. And he's doing crowdsourcing to get money so that they can have a school in Baltimore where they don't have to hire people who are gay. And I keep talking to him. I mean, this is a very caring, lovely person. And he said, no, it's against the Bible, it's against this. And I say, you're not understanding. You know, you're being a stooge, because this is nonsense. I mean, the first time I went into a Nigerian church, you go up the front and there's all these men in pink lace dancing, and I'm saying, there's no homosexual.
Did you see the opening ceremonies of the Olympics? Kind of the same thing, right?
I mean, so I think it's a lot more frightening. And it goes back to Nazi Germany too, where Hitler said, well, I decide who's a Jew.
Right.
And it's the same mentality. And I think a lot of straight people are not understanding what the problems are. It's much more serious.
I think you're right. I mean, we have heard that there was a move in Kenya to pass a law like this, but I think a lot of people are hopeful that Kenya has a much stronger civil society that can resist this. There's very organized LGBT movement there. They're not powerful, but they're sort of organized enough at the level that they could maybe keep something bad from happening. But just the other day, the Democratic Republic of Congo talked about passing a law like this. I mean, this is a country that has a lot of stuff they've got to deal with, and they're actually going to take the time out to pass a law like this. It's a real concern. And I think a lot of it is political. I mean, and you don't have to go far back in our history to see when, you know, marriage initiatives were put on the ballots all across the United States to drive out certain people to vote against marriage, right? George Bush and Karl Rove did this, and it's the same thing. You're engineering opposition, and you're sort of stirring up opposition. But I think Nigeria is a challenge because it's the biggest, the richest. I don't know if it's the richest, but it's got tons of resources. It's strategically important for a lot of countries, so people are going to be less likely to criticize. But I think when you ask the polls in Nigeria, it's like in the 90-some% who say that homosexuality shouldn't be accepted.
Yeah, they all said
Let's just take one more question, and
Sure.
then we have to break.
Yep.
Okay, well, so in the more eastern countries, more specifically the Middle East, there's very strict like gender role type things going on. So if those gender role things were addressed, do you think that would also sort of help progress people on homosexuality because that would affect how people are using family values as an excuse for being against it. If men were also expected to take care of their families the same way that women are in those sort of countries, would that also progress the movement over there?
Yeah, I think it would. I think the sort of move for gender equality and sort of LGBT stuff are pretty intertwined, and I think those two things often go together. The Middle East is tough because I think strategically they've been left alone on this stuff, and nobody's really pushing hard from the international community. Nobody's really pushing them hard on stuff around LGBT issues because everyone's more concerned about, in some cases, there's war, breaking out, or terrorism concerns, or oil, that people don't want to mess with them. So Lebanon, Israel are both, well, Lebanon is now all of a sudden good on this, at least legally. Israel is good, is pretty strong. And I think there's some other countries like Jordan that you could probably see soon. But I think in places where there's a really strong sort of conservative Muslim majority, it's going to take a lot more time, I think. But if women's rights movement builds some steam, I think it can help.
Okay, thank you.
Great.